There are people who carry their whole lives in one pair of hands. They cook the meals and fix the fences and show up when no one else does, and the people they love grow so accustomed to the weight of those hands that they stop noticing it entirely. They stop noticing until the hands go still. And even then, sometimes they do not notice. They simply move on to the next arrangement, the next convenience, and they call it practical. They call it the sensible thing. Margaret Elaine Sutter had spent 61 years being the sensible thing for everyone around her. And when it was finally over, when the last of what she had built and tended and quietly held together was taken from her in the space of a single afternoon, she drove to a rusted barn on 12 acres of weedy ground outside Calverton, Georgia, and she did not cry. She sat in the cab of her old truck with the engine off, and she looked at the barn through the cracked windshield, and what she felt was not grief. It was something quieter than that, and something older. Recognition. If this story is already pulling at something in you, hit the like button and subscribe to Left Behind, and drop a comment below telling me where in the world you're watching from. She had almost nothing left. No one knew what was waiting. Keep watching. Margaret had grown up in Calverton the way a lot of women grow up in small Georgia towns, which is to say she grew up useful. Her mother, Vera, had been a practical woman in the way that women who have very little tend to become practical. Not from any particular philosophy, but from the simple arithmetic of survival. Her father, Dale, had worked timber his whole life and had the hands to show for it, broad and scarred and permanently stained at the creases with something that no amount of soap ever fully reached. They had not been wealthy people. They had not been unhappy people either. They had been the kind of people who fixed what broke and kept what worked and did not spend much time imagining other arrangements. Margaret had been the older of two daughters, and from early on she had understood, without anyone ever saying so directly, that older daughters and families like hers were load-bearing walls. Her sister, Darlene, was 9 years younger and had the kind of beauty that excused a person from certain kinds of work, and so Darlene had been excused, and Margaret had not, and neither of them had ever questioned this division very much. Margaret had not resented it, or if she had converted that resentment into something more useful, into competence, into the particular satisfaction of knowing how to do things correctly. She could rewire a lamp at 14. She could read a land survey at 16. She had spent her summers on the Hadley Reed farm 2 miles down the road from her parents' house, helping old Clem Hadley Reed manage his books and his fencing and his arguments with the county assessor. And by the time she was 20, she could tell you the yield per acre of a Georgia cornfield in a dry year and the going rate for pine timber at 3 different mills. And she could tell you which county commissioner you needed to talk to if you wanted a road variance approved without waiting. 18 months for it to happen. She had married Gerald Sutter when she was 23. Gerald was a good man in the way that some men are good, meaning he was honest and steady and did not drink and kept his word. And he had the added quality of being genuinely proud of Margaret's competence rather than threatened by it, which was not as common as it should have been. They had built something together over the years that was worth building. A small farm supply business that grew slowly and carefully into something that kept Calverton farmers supplied with everything from seed to equipment parts to the particular kind of advice that you only get from people who have actually worked the land themselves. They had 2 children, a son named Robbie and a daughter named Claire, and they had raised them in a house that smelled of coffee and cut grass and the particular oil that Gerald used on the tractor's engine. And it had been a good life, a real life, the kind that does not photograph well, but wears extremely well over time. Gerald had died 4 years ago, quietly and without much warning, a heart that had simply used itself up in the way that working hearts sometimes do. Margaret had grieved him in the way she did most things, steadily and without performance. And then she had gotten back to work because the business still needed running and the land still needed managing, and there was no one else to do it. The trouble had begun, as trouble often does in families, not with a single dramatic event, but with a slow accumulation of small decisions made by people who told themselves they were being reasonable. Robbie had moved back to Calverton 2 years after Gerald died, bringing with him a wife named Sandra who had grown up in Atlanta and had strong opinions about efficiency and what she called strategic thinking, which Margaret had come to understand was a way of describing the process of taking what someone else had built and reorganizing it to your own advantage. Robbie was not a bad man. He was simply a man who had married a very persuasive woman and had, over the years, become very well persuaded. The business should be restructured, Sandra had said, modernized. The old inventory system was inefficient. The supplier relationships were too informal. The property was carrying too much sentimental value and not enough market value. Margaret had listened to all of this and had nodded and had pointed out, carefully, that the inventory system worked precisely because she had built it to suit the particular rhythms of Calverton's farming calendar, that the supplier relationships were informal because she had spent 30 years making them personal, and that the property's value was something that would be more apparent over time than it was in any given quarter's balance sheet. Sandra had smiled at all of this with the smile of someone who has already decided and is simply waiting for the other person to finish speaking. Claire had come to visit the following spring, and Margaret had hoped for an ally, but Claire was living in Savannah and had 2 young children and a career that demanded most of her attention, and she had grown, over the years, into the habit of finding the middle ground between whatever Robbie wanted and whatever their mother wanted, which meant that in practice she tended to agree with Robbie while feeling genuinely bad about it. She had sat at Margaret's kitchen table and held her coffee cup in both hands and said, "Mom, I think Robbie just wants to make sure the business is protected." And Margaret had looked at her daughter and had understood that protected was the word they were using now for the process that was already underway. The formal meeting had happened in February, 14 months after Gerald's death, in the office of a lawyer in Calverton whose family had been clients of the farm supply business for decades, which Margaret had thought would be relevant, and which turned out not to be relevant at all. Robbie had brought Sandra in a spreadsheet. Claire had brought her apologies in advance. The lawyer had brought a set of documents that had clearly been prepared some time before this meeting was officially proposed. The business would be transferred to a new LLC structure, with Robbie as the managing partner. Margaret would retain a minority interest in a consultancy arrangement. The land the business sat on, which Margaret and Gerald had owned outright, would be transferred to the LLC as a capital contribution. Margaret's house, which sat on a separate parcel, would remain hers. She would receive a monthly payment, described in the documents as a retirement distribution, which was enough to live on comfortably if she was careful and did not have any significant medical expenses and did not expect to travel or repair anything major. Margaret had read every page of those documents, slowly and without expression, while Robbie talked about legacy and sustainability and making sure Gerald's work endured. She had asked 3 specific questions about the valuation methodology used for the business assets. The lawyer had answered 2 of them fully and deflected the third. She had asked whether the consultancy arrangement included any actual decision-making authority. Sandra had answered before Robbie could, and the answer was no. She had looked at her son across the table, and she had seen on his face the complicated expression of a person who knows he is doing something that cannot be entirely justified, but has found a way to believe that it can. She had signed the documents. She had driven home. She had sat at Gerald's old desk, and she had looked at the photograph of the 2 of them taken in 1987, standing in front of the store on the day they had paid off the last of the original construction loan, both of them squinting into the summer sun with expressions of such uncomplicated satisfaction that it was almost painful to look at. And then she had opened the bottom drawer of the desk, the one that stuck in humid weather and that Gerald had always meant to fix, and she had taken out the folder that contained the deed to the Harlan property. The Harlan property was 12 acres of mixed Georgia red clay and sandy loam out past the Calverton town limits, on a county road that the GPS in most newer cars didn't bother to name. It had come to Margaret through her mother's side, an inheritance so remote and so modest that everyone in the family, including Margaret, had largely forgotten about it over the years. The original structure on the property was a barn, built sometime in the 1940s by a man named Cleet Harlan, her great-uncle by marriage, who had used it for equipment storage and, according to family legend, for a small-scale distilling operation that the county had known about and chosen not to pursue because Cleet had been the kind of man that counties choose not to pursue. Cleet had died in 1979. The property had passed through 2 other family members before landing, almost by accident, in Margaret's name as part of her mother Vera's estate settlement in 2009. Robbie and Claire had been present at that estate meeting. Neither of them had expressed any interest in the barn or the 12 acres it sat on. Robbie had actually said, standing in the parking lot afterward, well, at least it's not a liability. And then they had all gone to lunch and talked about other things. The barn had been left to sit. Margaret had driven out there twice in the 15 years since, once to make sure the property taxes were being assessed correctly, and once because she had driven past the county road turnoff on her way home from somewhere else and had turned down it on impulse. She had not gone inside. The padlock on the main door was rusted through in several places, and the chain holding it was more rust than metal at this point. And the barn itself had the look of a building that had made a private arrangement with the surrounding landscape and preferred not to be disturbed. On the day after she signed Robbie's documents, Margaret loaded 3 things into the cab of her truck: the deed to the Harlan property, a flashlight with fresh batteries, and the pair of heavy leatherwork gloves she had kept in the bottom of the hall closet for 30 years. She drove out the county road in the early morning before the Georgia heat had fully committed to the day, and she turned down the unnamed road, and she drove until the cleared land gave way to scrub pine, and the scrub pine gave way to the particular stillness that accumulates around a place that has not been visited in a long time. The barn was larger than she remembered. Or perhaps it was that the scrub around it had grown in enough that the building now sat in a kind of clearing rather than open land, and the clearing made the barn's dimensions more apparent. It was a Georgia bank barn, built into a slight slope in the way that her great-uncle's generation had built things, with the upper level accessible from the high side of the ground, and the lower level opening from a downhill face. The vertical board and batten siding had gone silver gray the way unpainted wood goes in the Georgia climate, and several of the boards on the west wall had warped away from their backing strips and were letting in wedges of morning light. The standing seam metal roof had held better than the walls, which was not uncommon, and though there was rust along the ridgeline and at least one section of flashing that had pulled loose from the eave, it was not, she noted, a roof that had failed. It was a roof that had endured. She got out of the truck and stood in the dew-damp grass and looked at it the way she had always looked at things she was considering, without hurry, with the kind of attention that takes inventory rather than making judgments. The 2 large sliding doors on the upper level, facing the high side of the slope, were held shut by a newer padlock than she expected, a heavy brass cylinder that had not rusted through in the same way the old chain had. Someone had replaced it at some point, or had had it replaced, and the thought of that stopped her for a moment. She checked the chain. The links were steel, not the old iron she'd expected, and they were locked through the door handles with a tension that suggested someone had put thought into keeping this particular entrance closed. She walked around to the lower level. The downhill door was a single vertical plank door, narrower than the main sliding doors above, and it was held by a simple barrel bolt that had rusted in place. She worked it with the heel of her hand, pushing and rotating at the same time the way you work a stuck thing that has not been moved in years rather than decades. And after 3 minutes of patient effort, she felt it give a quarter turn, and then it moved freely, and the door swung inward with the kind of sound that old wood makes when it relinquishes a long argument. The smell that came out was not the smell of rot. That was the first thing she registered, and it stopped her at the threshold the same way an unexpected detail in an old document stops you when you're auditing books. She had expected the particular sweetness of organic decay, the smell of damp wood working itself slowly back into the earth. What she got instead was something drier and older than that, dust that had settled and compressed over decades rather than mold that had worked its way through the structure. The lower level had been sealed better than it appeared from the outside. The air had not been moving in this room for a long time. She switched on the flashlight and stepped inside. The lower level of the barn was divided into 3 sections by low board partitions that would have originally created separate pens for equipment or animals. The first section, nearest the door, held the remnants of what had been Clete Harlan's workshop, a workbench along the north wall, several metal shelves still holding the shapes of the canning jars and coffee cans that had once organized as hardware, and the empty brackets where tools had hung that were now, presumably, long since removed or deteriorated. The floor was packed earth, hard and dry. The second section held something she had not expected. Stacked neatly along the east wall, on wooden pallets that had kept them off the ground, were 14 wooden crates. Not deteriorated, not open, sealed with wire-strapped lids in the way that agricultural equipment crates were sealed, and stenciled on each one in black paint with a series of letters and numbers that she recognized, after a moment, as part of a catalog system. She ran the flashlight over the stenciling and felt the particular sensation of a person who is looking at something that does not fit the context they were expecting, and who knows from long experience that when something does not fit the context you were expecting, the correct response is not to dismiss it, but to pay closer attention. She checked the third section of the lower level. Empty except for an old oil drum lying on its side in the far corner, and, next to it, something that caught the light of her flashlight and held it in a way that made her stop walking. Against the wall, half concealed behind the oil drum, was a door. Not a large door, perhaps 4 feet high, built into the wall itself, with a frame that had been set deliberately into the barn's foundation structure rather than cut into it afterward. It was built, she understood after a moment of looking at it, to be hidden. The framing matched the rough-sawn lumber of the barn wall so closely that in any light other than direct flashlight illumination, you would not have seen it as a door at all. You would have seen a section of barn wall with what appeared to be a natural variation in the board spacing, a seam that looked like settling or shrinkage, but was, in fact, the gap between the door and its frame. There was a keyhole in the door, small and brass, and considerably less rusted than the padlock on the upper entrance. She tried the door without the key, and it did not move. She stood in the lower level of the Harlan barn with her flashlight and her work gloves and the smell of decades-old sealed air around her, and she was quiet for a long time. Outside, a bird she couldn't identify was working through the same 3 notes over and over in the scrub pine at the edge of the clearing. The morning was warming up. She needed to find the key to that door. She walked back to the upper level through the outside, studying the barn's construction as she went. Clete Harlan hadn't known how to build. The foundation was fieldstone, dry-laid, but laid with care, and the sill plates sitting on it were old-growth heart pine that would outlast anything the current century had to offer. She stood at the big sliding doors and looked at the newer padlock and thought about what it meant that someone had replaced it at some point. It meant someone had been here after Clete. It meant someone had wanted the upper level secured. She looked at the doors, and then she looked at the padlock again, and she noticed what she had not noticed on her first look. There were 2 keys on the padlock's identifying tag, one for the padlock itself, and one that was smaller and older, with a distinctive bow shape that she had seen before on antique furniture hardware and on old cabinetry locks. Whoever had replaced this padlock had attached a second key to it, and they had done it deliberately. She did not know who had replaced the lock or when. She did not know yet who had put those 14 crates in the lower level, or built the hidden door, or sealed the air in that lower room so carefully that it still smelled of old lumber and old Georgia dust rather than the wet collapse of abandoned space. She did not know what was behind the door. What she knew was this. She had come to this barn with nothing except the deed to 12 acres and the particular stubbornness that comes from 61 years of knowing how to pay attention to things other people have dismissed. She had signed away 30 years of work the day before yesterday. Her son had looked at her across a lawyer's table and had believed he was being practical. Her daughter had held her coffee cup and found the middle ground. The people in Calverton who had known Margaret Sutter for decades would hear, within the week, that she had driven out to some old property she'd inherited and was living out of her truck in a falling-down barn, and they would shake their heads with the particular expression people use when something confirms what they had always quietly suspected about a person's limits. She took the identifying tag off the padlock. She took both keys. She went back around to the lower-level door, and she stood in front of the small hidden door in the barn wall, and she fit the smaller key into the keyhole, and she felt it catch, and she felt the pins move, and she heard the bolt draw back with a sound that was unexpectedly clean, unexpectedly precise, the sound of a mechanism that had been made well enough to function correctly even after a very long time waiting to be used. She put her hand flat against the door and pushed it open. The smell hit her before her eyes adjusted. Not decay, not damp, something closer to the inside of an old cedar chest, the kind her mother had kept at the foot of the bed, the kind that held things worth keeping, dry and close and faintly resinous, the smell of a space that had been sealed with intention rather than neglect. She brought the flashlight up and stepped through the low door frame, ducking her head, and straightened on the other side. The room was roughly 12 feet by 15. The walls were poured concrete, which explained the seal, and the floor was the same, smooth and cracked in places but intact. Someone had built this room inside the barn's foundation, set it into the slope of the land the way the whole lower level was set into the slope, but with considerably more deliberateness than the rest of the structure. The concrete was old, Depression-era old, she thought, looking at the aggregate and the finish, which had the particular texture of work done by hand rather than machine. Clete Harlan had not built this room as an afterthought. He had built it first, or close to first, before the barn went up around it. There were shelves along 2 walls, floor to ceiling, built from the same heart pine as the barn's sill plates. On the shelves were boxes, not deteriorated cardboard, not rotted wood, but metal. Galvanized steel document boxes, the kind that had been manufactured for archival and fireproof storage, and they were stacked with a precision that spoke of someone who had organized this room the way Margaret organized a set of annual accounts, methodically and with the expectation that someone would need to find things in a specific order at a later date. She counted 31 boxes on the 2 shelved walls. On the 3rd wall, beneath a shelf that held nothing, there was a small writing table, also heart pine, bolted directly to the concrete. On the table was a single item, a ledger, bound in dark green cloth, its spine and corners reinforced with brown leather that had dried and cracked, but not crumbled. Beneath the ledger, tucked precisely under its front cover, was a sealed envelope. Margaret did not touch anything yet. She stood in the middle of the room and turned slowly with the flashlight and took full inventory before she touched a single thing, because that was how she had always worked, and she was not going to change it now. She was looking for damage, for moisture intrusion, for any evidence of the kind of deterioration that would tell her the contents of those boxes were beyond recovery. She found none. The concrete had done what concrete does when it is poured correctly and left alone. It had held. She picked up the ledger first. It was heavier than it looked, and when she opened it, the spine cracked softly, but the binding held. The handwriting inside was small and precise, written in the kind of fountain pen script that had been common among men of Clete Harlan's generation who had received any formal education at all, and the entries began in 1938 and ran without interruption to 1971, which was 8 years before Clete had died. The ledger was not a financial record, or not only a financial record. It was something closer to an operational log, recording transactions and arrangements and agreements in shorthand that was partially obvious and partially coded, using initials and place names and a system of numerical notation that Margaret could follow and outline, if not in every detail. What she could follow clearly was this. Clete Harlan had been, over the course of 33 years, the unofficial repository for a significant portion of the privately held records and assets of 7 different families in Calverton County, Georgia. Not contraband, not anything that appeared to be illegal or not straightforwardly so. Documents, deeds, promissory notes, stock certificates, correspondence, the kinds of records that people entrust to someone they trust absolutely when they do not trust the institutions that are supposed to hold such things, and when those institutions have, in living memory, failed them. She opened the envelope under the ledger. Inside was a single sheet of paper, written in the same hand as the ledger, but with less compression, as if Clete had known this was the document someone would read first and had given it room to breathe. To whoever holds the deed to this property, it read, "If you're reading this, you're either family or you're the right person. I have chosen to believe those are the same thing. Everything in this room was placed here in trust. The ledger will tell you whose it is and what it is and where each item came from. I kept meticulous records because I understood that the value of what is stored here is not the thing itself, but the proof of the thing, and proof requires a chain that does not break. I am old now, and I have no children, and the people I store these things for are mostly gone, but their children are not gone, and their children's children are not gone, and what belongs to a family belongs to it across time, not only across the years when the patriarch is alive to defend it. I sealed this room in 1971 because I believed someone would come for these things eventually, and because I had learned in my life that what you protect carefully enough will survive long enough to matter. The key to this room has been with this property's deed since the day I sealed it. If you have the deed, you have the right to be here. What you do with what you find is between you and your conscience and the families whose names are in the ledger. I trust you do right by them. Clete Harlan, July 14th, 1971. Margaret sat down on the writing table's chair, which held her weight with only a slight protest, and read the letter again. Then she sat quietly for several minutes with the flashlight balanced on her knee, throwing a circle of yellow light at the concrete ceiling while she thought. She was not, by temperament, a person who dramatized her own moments. She had read the letter. She understood what it said. And now she was working through the implications with the same methodical attention she would have brought to a complicated tax question or an equipment lease that contained provisions she didn't immediately like. What she was sitting in was not simply a hidden room in a family barn. She was sitting in the result of a decision a man had made 50 years ago to protect things that were worth protecting, using the tools available to him, which are a poured concrete room and meticulous records, and the knowledge that land outlasts nearly everything else when it is properly held. She thought about the 14 wooden crates in the outer room. She thought about the newer padlock on the upper barn doors and the second key attached to it. Someone had been here after Clete. Someone had added to what was here or had checked on what was here and had cared enough about its security to replace the exterior lock while leaving the inner room undisturbed. She did not know who that had been. It was in the ledger, she suspected, or somewhere in the 31 galvanized boxes. She would find out. She spent the rest of that first morning doing what she knew how to do. She opened 5 of the galvanized boxes, selecting them from the positions that corresponded to the earliest entries in the ledger's organizational system, and she examined their contents methodically and without disturbing the arrangement of any individual item. What she found in those 5 boxes alone was sufficient to hold her attention for the remainder of the morning and to restructure several assumptions she had held about the nature of what she had inherited. The first box held property deeds, 7 of them, all for parcels in Calverton County, ranging in size from 2 acres to 40. The deeds were dated between 1922 and 1947. 3 of them were for parcels that Margaret recognized as land that had subsequently changed hands and been developed into what were now, among other things, a gas station, a storage facility, and a strip of commercial property along the county road that currently held 4 businesses and a bank branch. The names on the deeds were not names she recognized from those current businesses. There were other names, older names, names she would need to research. The second box held correspondence, bundled in groups and labeled in Clete's hand with the initials of the parties involved. The letters were brittle at the edges, but legible throughout, preserved by the dry sealed air in a way that a university archive would have been proud of. She did not read them in full that morning. She read enough of each bundle to understand its general nature and to confirm that Clete's system was as organized as the ledger suggested. The third box held stock certificates and bond instruments from companies that had operated in Georgia between the 1920s and the 1960s. Some of those companies still existed in recognizable form, under different names, absorbed into larger entities over the decades. Others did not. The value of these instruments was not immediately calculable, but the existence of them was unambiguous. The fourth box held something she had not expected and which stopped her hands entirely for a full minute when she lifted the lid. It held surveying records, hand-drawn, meticulous, dated, and signed by a licensed surveyor whose name she recognized from county records. The surveys described, in technical detail, the original boundaries of 17 properties in Calverton County, including survey markers and reference points that would allow a current surveyor to reestablish those boundaries precisely. She understood, looking at these surveys, what Clete Harlan had understood, that in Georgia, as in most of the American South, the recorded history of land ownership was not always the accurate history of land ownership, and that the difference between those two histories had consequences that could travel across generations without anyone ever naming them directly. The fifth box held a handwritten document that ran to 43 pages, and that was dated in 1968. It was a personal account, written in Cleet's hand, but describing events and transactions he had witnessed rather than initiated, covering a period between 1931 and 1967. It was signed and notarized. It was, she understood after reading the first 8 pages, a sworn account of certain property transactions and legal proceedings in Calverton County during those years, written by a man who had been present for many of them and who had kept, in his galvanized boxes, the documentary evidence to support what he was swearing to. She closed the 5th box and sat with her hands flat on its lid and looked at the shelves around her and understood that she was not sitting in a room full of old paper. She was sitting in the room that Cleet Harlan had built specifically so that the truth of certain things could not be permanently buried by the people who had tried to bury it. And she had arrived here because her son had reorganized the business and her daughter had found the middle ground, and no one had thought to look twice at the barn. She drove back into Calverton that afternoon for supplies. She stopped at the hardware store for a padlock of her own, a good one, for the inner room's door, which she noted had a hasp that had been prepared for exactly this purpose. She stopped at the grocery for food she could prepare without much equipment. She stopped at the county library and used their computer terminal for 45 minutes, running searches on the company names from the stock certificates and on the property addresses from the deeds. And what she found in those 45 minutes was enough to confirm that what was in those galvanized boxes was not merely historically interesting, but was legally and financially significant in ways that she was not yet fully equipped to assess on her own. She drove back out to the barn in the early evening. She made a camp of sorts in the upper level, which was structurally sounder than the lower and which caught the evening breeze through the gaps in the board siding. She set up the folding camp cot she had stopped to buy at the farm supply store off the highway, the one that was not her family's farm supply store anymore, and she made coffee on a small propane burner, and she ate a sandwich, and she sat in the barn's upper level with the door open to the Georgia evening and watched the tree line at the edge of the clearing go dark. Her phone had rung 4 times during the day. Robbie twice. Sandra once. Claire once. She had not answered any of them. She would answer when she had something worth saying, and she did not have that yet. She had questions worth asking. She had 31 galvanized boxes and a 43-page sworn statement and 17 property surveys and the beginning of an understanding of what Cleet Harlan had spent 30 years assembling in a sealed concrete room under a barn that everyone in her family had dismissed as a liability. She thought about the 14 wooden crates in the outer room, which she had not yet opened. They bore catalog stenciling that she now recognized, cross-referencing it against the ledger's later entries, as part of a system Cleet had added in the 1960s for physical items rather than documents. Agricultural equipment, some of it, but not all of it. The ledger used a term for certain of the later crates that she had not initially understood and had now looked up in the library's agricultural history reference section. The term referred to a category of antique farm machinery and hand tools that had, in the decades since Cleet sealed the room, become significantly collectible. She was going to need help, not the kind of help that her children had offered her, which was the kind that reorganized what you had built and called a protection. She was going to need a particular kind of help, the kind that came from people who knew what they were looking at, which meant an attorney who understood property law and title claims, an appraiser who understood historical documents and instruments, and someone who understood the particular legal history of land transfer in Georgia in ways that would allow them to assess what Cleet's surveys and his sworn account actually meant for the families whose names were in the ledger. She had been in Calverton her whole life. She knew who those people were. She knew which families were still there and which had moved away and which had been told, at some point in the past several decades, that certain land was not theirs to claim and had accepted that telling because they had not had the evidence to push back on it. She knew some of those families personally. She had sold seed to some of them for 30 years. Robbie called again at 9 in the evening. She picked up this time. "I just wanted to make sure you're safe," he said. "You don't have to stay out there, Mom. You can come home." She listened to the particular quality of his concern, which was genuine, she believed, and also convenient. "I'm safe," she said. "I'm going to be out here for a while. There are some things I need to look into." "What kind of things?" "Property matters," she said. Cleet Harlan kept records. There was a pause on the line. Robbie knew the name the way all of them knew it, vaguely, as a piece of family history too remote to be relevant. That old barn isn't going to have anything useful in it, Mom. It's been sitting empty for decades. She looked at the lamp on the camp table, and at the ledger she had brought up from the lower level, and at the pages of notes she had made that afternoon in her careful, compressed handwriting. "You might be surprised," she said. She said it quietly and without emphasis, the way she said most things that she was certain of. She ended the call. Outside the barn, the Georgia night had settled in fully, and the tree frogs were working through their catalog, and somewhere down the county road a dog was conducting an argument with something in the darkness. She poured the last of the coffee and opened the ledger to the section she had marked, the one that cataloged the contents of the 14 wooden crates, and she began to read. She read until well past midnight. When she finally put the ledger down and turned off the lamp and lay on the camp cot with the Georgia darkness around her and the smell of old heart pine in the air, she was not thinking about what had been taken from her 2 days ago. She was thinking about what Clete Harlan had left for her, and about how long it had been waiting, and about the particular patience of things that are sealed up carefully by someone who trusts that the right person will eventually arrive to open them. She gave herself one more day alone with the room before she made any calls. She wanted to be certain she knew what she was holding before she put it in anyone else's hands. By mid-afternoon of the second day, she had cataloged all 31 boxes. Clete Harlan had spent 33 years collecting and preserving the documentary evidence of what had happened to land and property belonging to 11 families in Calverton County between 1922 and 1967. Some of what had happened was the ordinary kind of loss. Some of it was something else entirely. 3 of the property transfers documented in those boxes had been accompanied by legal proceedings where the outcome had been determined not by evidence, but by who was sitting on which side of the courtroom and who owed what to whom in the particular economy of obligation that governed small Georgia counties in the middle of the 20th century. The 14 wooden crates held antique farm equipment packed with the care of someone who understood what they were preserving and furniture. Handmade pieces from actual households, wrapped in oilcloth and packed in sawdust, each one tagged in Clete's hand with a name and a date and where it had come from. These were not investments. They were things entrusted to him by people who had needed to leave quickly and had trusted him to hold what they could not carry. He had held them for decades without telling a soul. She made 3 calls on the morning of the 3rd day. The first was to an attorney in Atlanta named Ruth Demery, a woman she had met once at a land-use conference 12 years ago and kept in her address book on the strength of a single conversation about easement law. The second was to an appraiser in Savannah who knew antique farm equipment better than anyone in Georgia. The third was to a woman named Delia Okafor, a schoolteacher in Calverton whose family name appeared in Clete's ledger in connection with 2 of the property surveys, and whose grandmother had talked about a piece of lost land until the day she died. Ruth Demery spent 4 hours in the sealed room and emerged saying it was going to be complicated and that some claims would be stronger than others, and that the survey records were remarkable. Margaret said she understood. Ruth asked why she wasn't asking about money. Margaret said, "I know what it's worth. I'm asking what it can do." Ruth was quiet for a moment. For the families in that ledger, she said finally it could do quite a lot. The story reached Calverton before Margaret was ready for it. The way stories always reach small towns, approximately accurate and moving fast. People heard that Margaret Sutter had found something in her family's barn, that it involved Atlanta lawyers and Savannah appraisers, that it involved land, old land, land that had changed hands in ways that were now being examined by people who had the documentation to examine them. Robbie drove out on a Saturday morning and stood in the clearing in his office clothes looking at the barn and at his mother's truck and at the extension cord running from the generator to somewhere inside. Margaret came out to meet him. She was wearing work clothes and her leather gloves, and she had coffee in one hand, and she looked, he told Claire later, like herself. Like the version of herself he hadn't seen in years without being able to name what had been missing. He said he was sorry without any documents or spreadsheets present. He said Sandra had been wrong, and he had let her be wrong because it was easier than the alternative. Margaret listened and understood that the sorrow was genuine, and that genuine sorrow doesn't change what happened, but is a real thing nonetheless. She told him what she had found. She watched his face while she told him, and she watched him understand what it meant that no one had thought to look twice at the barn. The furniture in the wooden crates went to the families whose names were on cleats tags. Every piece, without exception, because that was not a legal question and never had been. The antique equipment went to auction, the proceeds directed into a fund for the families in the ledger. This was not Margaret's money to decide about. She had understood that from the beginning. What had been in those boxes had never been hers. She was simply the person who had arrived to open the room. Delia Okafor came to visit on an evening in late summer, and they sat outside the barn and talked for a long time about Delia's grandmother and about what it meant to know a thing was true for 50 years without having the proof to make anyone else know it too. Delia said, "My grandmother used to say that lost things know where they belong. They just can't always get back there on their own." Margaret thought about Cleet building his room and sealing it and attaching the key to the deed and dying with the absolute faith that the right person would eventually hold that deed and know what to do. She didn't say any of this. She just sat with it in the Georgia evening with the tree frogs working and the barn's silver boards holding the last of the light and the smell of red clay in the air around them. She had driven to a barn with a flashlight and a pair of leather gloves. She had paid attention to a smell that was wrong. She had looked at a door built to look like a wall. She had found a key on a padlock tag left there by a man who trusted that the right hands would eventually reach for it. That was all she had done. That was everything. What is left behind is never truly lost. It is only waiting for someone patient enough, stubborn enough, and quiet enough to find it. Thank you for sitting with this story all the way to the end. The people who stay for the whole story are the ones who understand it. If it moved you, the videos on your screen right now are waiting to do the same. And if you haven't subscribed yet, come home. Left Behind has a story for you.